Okay, so we just finished talking about the different types of glands, endocrine versus exocrine. So one more time, exocrine glands are different from endocrine glands in what way? Exocrine glands release their substance onto the surface of the body or into an organ. Anything else? They have ducts. Good. Okay, so exocrine glands are also more numerous than endocrine glands. And if you think about it, think of all the parts of our body that's actually sweats, that's able to sweat. So they're more diffuse throughout the body, whereas endocrine glands, there's just like one particular gland that has that function. There's just a bunch more sweat glands, for example, than there are endocrine. Secrete products into ducts, secretions released onto body surfaces, such as the skin, or into body cavities. Examples of endocrine glands are mucus glands, sweat glands, oil glands, and salivary glands. And some exocrine glands are single cell, as we saw before. Those are called goblet cells. And goblet cells produce mucus. Okay? Mucus. I think when we looked at, I'm going to go back to that now, pseudostratified epithelium. Well, you don't really see them here, but yeah, this is what the goblet cells. So what the goblet cells do, again, is secrete mucus. Remember in the respiratory tract, I think we talked about this. The cilia, yeah, we talked about cilia and the importance of cilia in the respiratory tract. What did we say about mucus? Mucus is on top of the cilia, right? So when we breathe in dust, the dust gets trapped in the mucus. It's kind of a thick, sticky material, and so it traps the particles, whatever the particles may be, and the cilia just push the mucus on up to the throat. Okay. So I was wanting to see if they had a labeled goblet cell there. So that's what goblet cells are. Single cells that secrete mucus. And most of the exocrine glands are multicellular. And these are just some of the categories that you all don't really need to know for the test. Microvilli. So here's an example also. We need to know those? No, you don't need to. So this is one cell, a single cell. And so if you think of one cell being able to make some chemical, and that chemical has to be released. This is just showing you how it would look on the inside. So if a cell's job, so we talked about the different jobs of cells. Some cells contract, other cells transmit electrical signals. Well, these cells' job is to make substances that the body needs. So if a cell is doing that, obviously the instructions for making the cells is where? The DNA, right, in the nucleus. So it tells the cell which proteins to make. And then from there, the cell can also make lipids, carbs, whatever needs to be secreted. And those are going to be stored in secretory vesicles that will be released at the appropriate time. So that's an example of one of those cells making substance. So the method of secretion of glandular products fall into one of these categories. There are merocrine type secretions, and they have vesicles that release their excretion by exocytosis. And if you look closely at these cells, So you can see the cells here form the duct, and the cells themselves have the products that are going to be released by exocytosis from each individual cell. So the way the cell releases it is by exocytosis. And that's one way. And you have apocrine glands, which are the same in terms of the way they secrete. And then you have something called holocrine glands, where cells accumulate a product and then the entire cell itself disintegrates. And the particles of the disintegrated cell are what the secretion becomes. Okay, so the secretion comes from the breaking down of the cells, and the breaking down of the cells, the components become the secretion. And that's called holocrine. Pretty much you can remember because the whole cell is part of the secretion. And how is that different from here? The whole cell is staying intact. The cells are just secreting some substance from the cell, but nothing is happening to the cell. So compare that way of secreting to this way, in which the complete cell breaks down and becomes the secretion. Okay? And it's, for example, in oil glands of the scalp and glands of the eyelids. This is the example. Connective tissue. So now we're on to the second type of tissue. So how many epithelial types of tissue did we talk about? We had simple, squamous, simple. How many simples? Simple squamous, simple cuboidal, and simple columnar. And how many stratified? Well, there's one pseudostratified. So that's one layer. How many stratified? Well, really, that you all need to focus on, it's really just stratified squamous epithelium. You have keratinized and non-keratinized. But then you also have transitional. Remember, transitional is stratified because it's more than one layer. Okay, and just going back to remember some of the characteristics, some general characteristics of epithelial tissue. Remember the epithelial tissue, the cells what? Are close together, right? And those cells are all connected to the basement membrane. Well, all the cells, if it's a simple layer, and if it's a stratified layer, the bottom row of cells are connected to the basement membrane. So all epithelial tissue has a basement membrane that connects the epithelium to the next layer of the tissue. Okay, connective tissues, the cells usually occupy less space than the extracellular material. And so one way of saying that is in connective tissue, there is more matrix than cells. So if you remember, the tissue is defined as what? Right, groups of cells. So, up here, the example of the tissue, we're going to have a lot of cells in here. So in this tissue, you have the cells, and what else is in the cell? Or in the tissue? Cell products, or the extracellular material between the cells of that tissue. So all of this out here is referred to as matrix. Okay, so in a tissue, you have the cells, and then you have the matrix of a tissue. Okay, so the cells are there. The matrix is everything outside of the cells, those cells. So in connective tissue, there is more matrix than cells. In epithelial tissue, we saw that what? They're mostly cells, okay, not much matrix in epithelium. So another thing about connective tissue is that most of the cells of connective tissues are not in direct contact with each other. So they're separated by the matrix. Okay? And the extracellular matrix is sometimes just referred to as extracellular material. You'll hear ECF, being the material outside of the cell. Same stuff. And then you have vascularity. So what did we say about the vascularity of epithelium? So epithelium was avascular. What about connective tissue? So connective tissue is vascular, in fact, highly vascular, richly supplied with blood vessels. There are exceptions. So the connective tissue type that does not have blood vessels is cartilage. So cartilage is a connective tissue, but it is the one that does not have blood vessels. So you could say cartilage then is avascular. The avascular connective tissue. Connective tissues are the most abundant and widely distributed and histologically variable of the primary tissues. So compared to epithelium, you have more connective tissue on more parts of the body. And if you think of it, our bones are connective tissue. Our fat tissue is a type of connective tissue. And then even our skin, the dermis of the skin is, okay. The dermis of the skin is connective tissue. Phones on silent, please. I just get distracted. All right, so those are the characteristics of connective tissues. What are some functions? So the easiest way to think of functions is to think of which tissues or what part of the body the tissues are found in. So we have tendons and ligaments, which are connective tissues. Bones and cartilage are made of connective tissue. Okay, even blood. So blood is considered a connective tissue. So they serve these functions based on where they're found in the body. Binding of organs, tendons, and ligaments. What are tendons? Right. So tendons connect what? Tendons connect what to what? Muscles to bones. And then ligaments connect bone to bone. Yeah. Okay. So think of, you probably don't think of ligaments too much unless you are into sports. But a tendon, where's one of your tendons that you can palpate easily? You know where it is. Right. What's that A word? The Achilles tendon? Where's your Achilles tendon? Right. So it says a tendon connects muscle to bone. So this tendon, my Achilles tendon, is connecting my calf muscle to my heel. Okay? What about a ligament? You hear about ACL injuries? So ligaments connect bone to bone. So connecting our thigh bone to our leg bone. And you all know those now, right? What's the thigh bone called? So connecting the femur to the big bone of my leg. The tibia. So the tibia. So the femur and tibia are connected by ligaments. ACL is anterior cruciate. And you have posterior cruciate, lateral and medial. See, now you all know what those mean. ACL is anterior. M is medial. L is lateral. lateral, collateral, sometimes lateral cruciate ligaments. So those hold those two bones together. So if they're torn, what do you think the problem is? So if a person tears, so think of those ligaments as holding holding the thigh to the leg. Have you all ever seen one of those injuries happening? No, I don't watch football. Well, you can see if there's a hyperextension, too far back or too far in or too far out, they can tear. And that means there's no more stability of the knee because there's nothing really holding it to the thigh. If that makes sense. So those are common sports injuries. Even in basketball recently. It used to be mostly in football. But a couple of basketball players have those. All right, bones and blood. So blood you can really think of in this way, where the cells are spread out. So, for example, red blood cells aren't sitting on top of each other. They're not stuck together. There's fluid between, right? Plasma, which is the matrix. All right. Ground substances. The main thing about this is to know that the ground substances are what make up the matrix, okay, of connective tissues. So this is just the medium through which solutes are able to diffuse between the blood and the actual cells to get nutrients to the cells within the connective tissue. So the components, you have interstitial fluid. You all be familiar with that word. So interstitial fluid is the fluid of any tissue. The fluid between the cells is referred to as interstitial fluid. It's also the same as extracellular fluid. So interstitial fluid is the same as extracellular fluid. So you would find interstitial fluid then in the matrix of a tissue. Okay? Extracellular fluid of a tissue. And also, they're called connective tissue because for the most part, they are going to connect or glue one part of the body to another. For example, the epithelium sits the epidermis sits on top of the dermis. So the dermis is connective tissue because it's connecting the skin to the rest of the body and gluing it there so it doesn't come apart. Okay, so the dermis and also the hypodermis are both connective tissues. And you can think of those as holding the complete organ together. All right, and a few things about fibers. So within the matrix of connective tissue, there are three types of fibers that you should be familiar with. Collagen fibers, you've heard of collagen. So these are made of protein. All of them are made of protein. All of the fibers. Collagen is the strongest of the fiber types, and it's called white fiber. They're tough, so they're found in areas where the tissue has to be tough but flexible and able to resist stretching. For example, tendons, ligaments, so those are tough. You can just touch your Achilles tendon and see how tough it is. And it resists stretching. Okay? And then you have elastic fibers, yellow fibers. And most of the connective tissues are going to have some variety of these types of fibers. It may have more white fibers than yellow, depending on the job that tissue has to do. And so yellow fibers are elastic, and these are found in tissues that have to stretch and recoil. And then you have reticular fibers in some tissues. And these are thin collagen fibers that are coated with a glycoprotein, sort of a carb structure. And they form the framework of such organs as the spleen and lymph nodes. So These are just the types of fibers in the matrix. And then we have the cell type. So in connective tissues, the types of cells you'll run into in this whole chapter and also the next chapter. And the next few chapters actually we'll talk about chondroblasts, chondrocytes, osteoblasts, osteocytes, adipocytes. So for most of those, you all probably already know what they mean. But get familiar with these two suffixes, blasts and cytes. So whenever you see one of those, you know it's referring to a what? Cell. Okay, so a cyte, C-Y-T-E, is a cell, and blasts are also cells. So most of our cells are referred to as cytes, but they come from blasts. So anytime you see blast, just think of it's a cell. It's going to become a cyte, but it's immature. And we'll see some examples of that. Anybody know what that means? So when you see that word root, it means cartilage. Okay, so a chondrocyte would be a what? A cartilage cell. Right, so the cells of our cartilage are called chondrocytes. And there are also chondroblasts. Right, so before that chondrocyte became a chondrocyte, it was a chondroblast. So they matured to become chondrocytes. Osteocytes and osteoblasts, the same thing. That word root refers to bones. Good. Okay? Or bone tissue. So an osteocyte would be what? A bone cell. Okay? So the cells of your bones, most of them are just referred to as osteocytes, but they developed from osteoblasts. And one thing about those two, I'll go ahead and tell you, the chondroblast, what happens is their cells, chondroblasts are immature cells, and their job is to make the bone matrix. Cartilage matrix. Osteoblasts make the bone matrix. So once they have made and released the matrix material, they become trapped in the stuff they made. Once they become trapped in the stuff they made, they're called cytes. Okay, so they're called blasts. The blasts actually make the matrix of that tissue. Chondroblasts make the matrix of the cartilage tissue. And then when they get trapped in that matrix that they made, they're called chondrocytes. Okay, and the same with osteoblasts. They make the bone matrix, become trapped in the matrix that they make. Once they're trapped, they are called osteocytes. Okay, then you have hemopoietic stem cells in bone marrow. Hemopoietic or hematopoietic, actually you'll see that both ways. Hemopoietic or hematopoietic. This word, hematopoietic, has to do with blood. The hema, that has to do with blood. So in the bone marrow, we have blood cells. And adipocytes, what do you think those are? Right, so adipose, you heard of adipose? So adipose is fat tissue. So adipose tissue is made up of adipocytes, which are fat cells. Leukocytes, mast cells, and macrophages are some of the cells that we find in connective tissues. And that's a good example of a connective tissue. So you see the different types of cells there, as well as the fibers, collagen and elastic fibers. All right, connective tissue category. So we'll just go through a few of these. Circulating connective tissue. So blood is a connective tissue. The main thing is you all are going to you should know for the test which subtype of tissue is found under which of the four major categories. So, for example, I may have which of these is a epithelial tissue, which one is a connective tissue. And you need to know that blood is a connective tissue. And then you have adipose, areolar, and reticular. Those are referred to as loose connective tissue. And dense connective tissues are elastic and irregular. Dense regular and dense irregular. And then the structural connective tissues, cartilage and bone. And the three types of cartilage are hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. And so as I go through these, I'll give you an idea of what you need to know about each. Again, there's a description for each of them, function as well as location. And this one is obvious. So you should know blood is a connective tissue. Know where blood is found in the circulatory system, right? In the blood and blood vessels. Its function, transport, right? What is being transported? Nutrients, right. Respiratory gases, what are those? Oxygen, right? Oxygen and CO2. And other substances. So that's the job of blood, to transport substances throughout the body. And the location, again, contained within blood vessels and also in the heart. Areolar tissue has a gel-like matrix with the three types of fibers we just mentioned. And they wrap and cushion organs, and they're widely distributed under epithelium. So they form the lamina propria of mucous membranes. Okay. And then adipose. So adipose tissue is made up of what type of cells? Fat cells, right. So in this picture, you can see the adipocytes, and you can tell by the nucleus. So what happens with these tissues, they're matrix as in areolar, but very sparse, closely packed adipocytes. The cells themselves fill with fat. Okay? And that the accumulation of fat causes the nucleus to be pushed to the side of the membrane. So the function, what is the function of adipose tissue? Provides a reserve food for fuel. So it stores nutrients in the event that you have to go a while without eating. So it insulates also against heat loss somewhat, and supports and protects organs. So you can imagine that their fat tissue is a shock absorber, which is why it accumulates primarily when women become pregnant on the abdomen, and that's to protect, if there's a fall, protect the fetus. Okay. Located under the skin in the hypodermis. So in the hypodermis, so on all of our body, we have, first what? Think about it. If you go through the skin, so first going through the skin, you have to go through what layer first? The epidermis, and then the dermis, and then the hypodermis. So the hypodermis is where we have an abundant amount of of adipose tissue. So that tissue is padding what's under there. What do you think is next after that? So after adipose tissue, well, that is the fat, the muscle, right? So any part of your body, you can go through those same layers: epidermis, dermis, hypodermis, which is your adipose, and then you get to the muscle. Okay, and then from the muscle, you get to the bone. Okay, and I bring that up because I know a lot of women have difficulty after they have a baby getting rid of the fat, the excess fat, And you always hear people say, well, just do crunches, do sit-ups. But does that work? No. I used to get sick of people telling me, do crunches, do. And the problem is, why won't crunches get rid of that? Because where is the muscle? Right, you can do crunches all day. You have a six-pack for sure, but it's hiding under the adipose. So you have to somehow get rid of the excess fat tissue, which sit-ups is not going to do. Okay, so you have to lose calories. And a lot of times when people lose weight, they lose everything but that. You know. So it's just one of the things of motherhood you have to deal with sometimes. That's what liposuction is good for, or tummy tuck. That's why a lot of people have those.
I saw a thing on TV this past week where they're doing some kind of like an injection, and it's not like they're having to do this stuff.
Yeah, I've heard of some other ways of doing that. Kind of burning it.
It's burning it, then it disintegrates.
I've heard of that. All right. So dense reticular, loose connective, dense regular. Dense regular connective tissue is what makes up ligaments and tendons. Dense regular connective tissue. So remember the ligaments and tendons, and make sure you know the difference. I'm sure I have a question on the test asking you to tell me or to choose the one that is a ligament. Is it the one that connects what? Bone to bone or muscle to bone? So ligaments connect bone to bone, tendons, muscle to bone. And again, an easy way to remember is try to think of an example. Your Achilles tendon, that's the easiest, connects what? Your calf muscle to the heel of your foot. And ligaments connect, right, femur to tibia, for example. Okay, and then you have dense irregular connective tissue. In the regular versus irregular, you can see the dense regular connective tissue, the collagen fibers are parallel, sort of a smooth appearance, whereas in dense irregular connective tissue, the collagen fibers are not as uniform. And these allow a tissue to be able to withstand tension exerted in many directions, and also providing structural strength. And this is found in the fibrous capsule of organs and of joints, the dermis of the skin, and the submucosa of the digestive tract. Main one for the test, just know the dermis of the skin. So remember, the epidermis is made of what? We'll usually throw a question on the test, making sure you all know which epidermis or dermis is made of which epithelium or connective tissue. Okay, so the epidermis is made of epithelium. What type? Not simple. Right, stratified. The skin cells, remember there's several layers, and the further those cells get away from the nutrient source, they die. So the stratified squamous epithelium, and the dermis is made of dense irregular connective tissue. And then elastic, dense connective tissue. The elastic tells you what its job probably is. It allows tissues to stretch and be able to recoil. And it probably has a lot more elastic fibers than collagen fibers, for example. And they're found in the walls of the large arteries, also in certain ligaments associated with the vertebral column, and within the bronchial tubes, where they're stretching and recoiling. Cartilage, and one of the characteristics of connective tissue is that they're highly vascular, and that exception is what? Cartilage. So cartilage lacks blood vessels, but it is still connective tissue. And Cartilage cells are either chondroblasts or chondrocytes, and you know the difference. Which one produces matrix? Chondroblast or chondrocytes? So the chondroblasts produce the matrix, and once the cell becomes trapped, it becomes a chondrocyte. And there are three types, so you should know the three types of cartilage: hyaline cartilage, elastic, and fibrocartilage. The hyaline cartilage, see if the picture here helps out a lot. It tells you where they're located. So you will need to know that hyaline cartilage is, so you know that, what is this bone called in the center of your chest? So that's the sternum, and the sternum is connected to the ribs. So the ribs are bones, and they connect to the sternum by little pieces of cartilage. So there's some cartilage connecting the sternum to the rib. Okay? And for that reason, you can actually do chest compression, because you really couldn't do that if it was all bone, could you? It would automatically just crack those bones. But that allows the chest compressions to actually massage the heart. So that's where we find hyaline, and also the embryonic skeleton. So when an embryo is developing, it doesn't start off with bones. It starts off with cartilage that is turned into bone during the process of development. Okay? And then it continuously throughout life covers the ends of long bones in joint cavities. And we'll talk about some of the others. Coastal cartilage, that's what the cartilage on the ribs, it's called coastal cartilage. And cartilage of the nose, trachea, and larynx. And we'll talk more about those later. Elastic cartilage is similar to hyaline cartilage, but there's more elastic fibers. So if you just look at the picture of the tissue, so you can see the cells in here. What are the white spaces? The white spaces are called lacuna. This will come up in this chapter and the next few chapters. The lacuna, you should know that the lacuna is this white space that the cell lives in. So remember, the cartilage cells, the chondroblast, make the matrix. So once the cell here makes this matrix, it's stuck in that space called the lacuna. And then we call it a what? Chondrocyte, once it becomes trapped in that space. So keep in mind lacuna. We'll bring that up again here soon. Okay. So looking at this one, it's not as smooth appearing because of the fibers, elastic fibers. And that's why it's called elastic cartilage, because it has more elastic fibers. And the function of elastic cartilage is to maintain the shape of a structure or organ while allowing great flexibility. So we know the ear, we can twist it all around because it's made of elastic cartilage. And then fibrocartilage, the last type of cartilage. The matrix is similar to, but less firm than in hyaline cartilage. And you can see more collagen fibers here. So remember, collagen fibers provided strength to a tissue. So the fibrocartilage here, found in the intervertebral disc, you know where those are? So you have the vertebrae, which are bones. In between each vertebrae, you have cartilage pads. And they are called intervertebral discs. Okay, so they're pretty strong and flexible to an extent, but they allow for shock absorption. Okay, so those are important there. And you can think of how the body would be different if those discs were not there. Do you think you would be less able to move around, less flexibility in moving forward and backward and so forth? All right, so those are the three types of cartilage. And bone tissue is also referred to as osseous. So osse or oste refer to bone. And bone tissue, again, bone tissue is a connective tissue, but it has a hard matrix, hard calcified matrix. So if you compare two connective tissues, bone to blood, how are they different? How is bone different from blood? Just off the top of your head. Right, bone is solid, blood is liquid. So the reason one is solid and the other is liquid is because of the matrix. Okay, so the matrix of blood is plasma, which is a liquid. The matrix of bone is made of calcium phosphates, which is hard. So that's what makes the two different, primarily different. And the function is different. So if you want, the blood is supposed to deliver nutrients. Well, that would be kind of difficult if the matrix was not fluid. So the function or the structure is based on what the function is. For bones, what do we need bones for? Right, support. So we need for it to be hard. So there's a difference in the matrix that the cell makes, and we'll talk more about that in a couple of chapters down the road. Okay, but also we just saw that word lacuna on the last slide. What is the lacuna? Right, so it's the space that the cell lives in, the cell becomes trapped in. So the same thing happens in osseous tissue. When the bone cells, which are originally osteoblasts, make the matrix, they get trapped in that matrix. And the space that they live in is called a lacuna. And that's where the osteocytes reside, in the lacuna. You really can't see it in this picture, but the space is there. You mostly just see the cells. Okay? And the other two tissues, so that's connective. So you have epithelial, connective, and now we'll look at muscular. Muscular is easy because there's only three types of muscular tissue. And muscular, if you just think about the function of muscles, their job is to what? Right, so they allow movement. And the way they do that is because the muscle cells themselves get short. Okay, so they contract. And by contraction, that means they go from being long cells to short cells during that process. So muscle tissues are made up of elongated cells that have the specialization of contracting in response to some type of stimulus. The primary job is to exert physical force on another tissue or an organ, and that way it produces movement. So the three types of muscle tissue are skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. And here are some things you need to know about those three types of muscle tissue. I will ask you, which of the three muscle tissues are voluntary, which are involuntary, which are striated, which are unstriated, which are multinucleated, which are uninucleated. All of that is on this slide here. So make sure you know those. So by voluntary versus involuntary, what are we saying? So up here it says skeletal muscle is voluntary. What do we mean by that? That means we control them. Okay, so when I want to move my arms, my skeletal muscles are contracting at my command. So I tell them when to contract. Okay? Cardiac muscle is involuntary. So we don't control our heartbeat? No. No, we don't. Okay, and smooth muscle. Where are smooth muscles? So skeletal muscle, pretty self-explanatory. You know where those are. I guess the name tells you they're mostly connected to bone, right? So the skeletal muscles are the ones that are connected to our bones for the most part. Our abdominal muscles are skeletal. Cardiac, the only place we find cardiac muscle tissue is where? In the heart. So the heart is made up of predominantly cardiac muscle tissue.
What did you say about the skeletal muscle? Is it involuntary or voluntary?
At the very top, skeletal muscle. Yeah. Smooth muscle is referred to as visceral muscle. So smooth muscle is found in involuntary areas or organs of the viscera, for example, such as the digestive tract, the stomach, the esophagus, the intestines. Those have muscles that have to contract in order to mix the food and propel it forward through the tract. Digestive tract. Huh? Yeah, we control them. Yeah. Well, yeah, that's called a reflex. So we do have reflexes that, very good point. So when a reflex occurs, I don't want to go too deep into it, but reflexes are still, the muscles themselves are voluntary because we control them. But sometimes a signal will come in and right back out to the muscle without going to the brain, without us controlling it in that way. So that's reflexes, which we'll get to in 202. But if you can control it, if you have any control at all over it, then it's considered voluntary. I hope that helps. Okay? The smooth muscle, we don't have any control over. So we can't tell the stomach to start mixing the food. That's automatic. We can't tell our pupils to dilate and constrict. Right? We have no control over that. So the iris contains smooth muscle. What else? Our blood vessels constrict and dilate, but we can't control that. So those are all involuntary. And striated. I wanted to make sure you all understood what that means. Striated versus non-striated. So two of them are striated. And that just means they appear to have stripes when you look at them. So the muscle fiber, so in this picture, you have, let's see, maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and part of another cell. So those are cells, individual cells, going across, so about 8 cells, going across the page. And so, as we said, muscle cells are long. Okay, so that is one muscle cell. And notice that one muscle cell has what? Several nuclei. Okay, so one muscle cell has several nuclei, but the nuclei are pressed to the outside because of all the material that is inside the muscle cell, which we won't get into right now. But if you're looking at the cells in that way, there are lines perpendicular to the length of the muscle cell. And those are called striations. Okay? So the lines going up and down are striations. So we have that in skeletal muscle, and we also have it in cardiac muscle. Okay, the striations, it's probably hard for you to see it from here, but they're all through here. And then the cardiac muscle also has these thicker connections called intercalated discs, and they connect one cardiac muscle cell to another. So this is one cardiac muscle cell. The two intercalated discs tell you where one ends and another begins. And then smooth muscles have no striations. Okay? So that's pretty much it for muscle. It's 3 types. Know which ones are voluntary, striated, uninucleated versus multinucleated, and also where they're located. And finally, nervous tissue. Body's communication system is made of nervous tissue, which includes the brain, nerves, and the spinal cord. And the main type of cell of the nervous system is called a neuron. So this neuron has three main parts. It has the dendrites, which is like tree branches. The center is called the cell body, or soma. And then you have the axon, which is the one long, usually a very long fiber, extends to send a signal to another cell. But we'll talk about those much later. In the nervous system, the cell types are neurons and then neuroglial cells, neuroglia, or glial cells. And the purpose or function of the glial cells is to support and protect the neurons and the rest of the nervous tissue. Okay? So we already went over these. And then you all know the types of tumors. Just have an idea when you see those what the differences are. All right, so that is chapter 4.